Hi everyone, and welcome to today's chat. My name is Trinia. I'm a team member here at Understood, and today we're going to be talking about reading interventions and instructional strategies. And we're super lucky to have Dr. Margie Gillis joining us. Margie is our go-to expert for all things literacy, especially when it comes to evidence-based strategies we can use with kids. Margie, thanks so much for being here today.
You're most welcome, Trinia.
And do you want to take just a minute to introduce yourself to our viewers?
Certainly. I am the president of an organization called Literacy How. We just recently converted Literacy How to a 501c3, a nonprofit organization. We provide professional development for teachers, pre-K through high school, obviously related to reading and writing, mostly in the state of Connecticut. We've done some training outside of the state. And we really are, our mission is to empower teachers with knowledge. We believe that a knowledgeable teacher who has good experience teaching children to read will do a great job, almost in spite of other barriers, which we will probably get to today. So knowledge is really the big variable in terms of getting the right results for kids.
Absolutely. Thank you. And just to let our viewers know, we will be taking your questions today. So if you have a question for Margie, go ahead and type it in the comments box. And we'll get to as many of those as we can. It's usually helpful if you can add your child's age or grade level. That way we can give a more targeted response. But to get us started, Margie, can you talk a little bit about if a parent notices that their kid is struggling with reading, what are some of the first things that they should think about or do? What should they do first?
The first step is to talk to the child's teacher. Obviously, the teacher who is spending the most time with the child in the classroom and observing the child's behaviors, specifically, related to reading, but obviously behaviors related to attention and so forth that also impact reading. And ask for data. So the data is super important, giving evidence of whether or not the student is performing on grade level with his or her peers, making sure that the teacher is well informed. Certainly a face-to-face conversation is always preferable. And as I said, just having data to look at so that they know what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's a great first step. And what are some of the different areas that kids might struggle with? And maybe we should break this down by age level. I don't know if that's useful or not. But what are the different areas of reading that parents might notice their kids struggling?
So I often explain to first point of explanation about reading, because reading really is very complex. We can think about reading having two different components that are very, very different. One is the ability to recognize words instantly, so word recognition skills that involve decoding. And the other component that is very different, but equally important, is being able to understand the language of text. So, having good oral language, spoken language, receptive, so understanding what they hear, and expressive, being able to express their ideas and thoughts. Again, two very different things. So if a child is struggling, are they struggling with decoding, but they have really good language comprehension skills? Or is it the reverse? Their decoding is totally fine, but they seem to struggle with the comprehension piece. And in some cases, children will have difficulty with both. But being able to describe those two different things is a good first step. And then based on which of those two things is, seems to be problematic, you would want to, know more, digging deeper into each of those components to understand what about word recognition is difficult. So then you really have to understand more about what goes into being able to, as I like to call it, lift the word off the page automatically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so really being able to break it down and figure out where your child is struggling can be super helpful in figuring out what sort of interventions or instructional strategies might be useful. So maybe we can take this just like one at a time. So you were talking about decoding. Maybe can you explain a little further about what we mean by decoding, and then also how do teachers go about teaching kids how to decode, and what are some of those strategies that are useful?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in order to recognize a word instantly, um, which is what good readers do, they don't even think about it anymore. They just see the word and it just immediately, know what it says and what it means. But if you came to a word that you'd never seen before, you would have to decode it. You would have to know what each letter sound, representative sound is, and you'd have to put all those sounds together to come up with the word, to blend those sounds and decode it. And because English happens to be a difficult language, we know this as English speakers and writers. It's one of the more difficult languages because English has different layers. There's different ways to pronounce different sounds, or rather, different letters have a number of different sounds, mostly the vowels specifically. But English is a logical language, so once kids learn the logic of English and understand how it works, they can absolutely become good decoders. The opposite of decoding is encoding, and that is spelling. So, in order to be a good speller, you have to hear the sounds, you have to know what those sounds represent in terms of letter or letters, and you have to know those vowel patterns specifically to be a good speller. Those two things, decoding and spelling, are reciprocal skills. So they kind of bootstrap each other, and so they should be taught reciprocally in school. Oftentimes spelling is like taught at a different time. It's taught very differently. So teaching those two together is one of the things I often talk to teachers and parents about, because they really do complement each other. Kids that have difficulty with decoding, we can assess that pretty quickly and easily by asking them to read nonsense words that have those different vowel patterns. And in a matter of minutes, we would know if the child can decode. And we use nonsense words because if you give them real words and they happen to have memorized lots of words, which some kids are really good at doing, then we don't know if it's actually a problem related to decoding. And so we would do quick, easy nonsense word assessment. We don't necessarily teach nonsense words, but we use it for assessment purposes. And then if that seems to be problematic for the child, we would dig even deeper and test their phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is an underlying skill, a very important foundational skill to be able to do that encoding that I was talking about before. So being able to spell well. And that's a hallmark of children that have dyslexia. They have difficulty with the decoding. They have difficulty with phonemic awareness. They have difficulty with encoding, the spelling. So we're just drilling down, digging deeper, as I like to say, to get to the root cause of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super helpful. I like how you pointed out that the decoding and the encoding should be taught at the same time. And just as a reminder that the decoding, for people who aren't reading experts like Margie, decoding is figuring out what those letters, what sounds those letters make, and putting them together to make a full word. And then the encoding, like Margie was saying, is the spelling and using those sounds and those letters to spell out the word. And that those use similar skills and similar brain areas. And so by teaching them at the same time, the kids are able to strengthen those skills at the same time as well. And Margie, we always get this question from parents. They want to know if there is a specific program that the school should be using, or what should they be looking for at the school in terms of how they're teaching reading and decoding skills and encoding skills to their kids.
So things to look for to make sure that the students are getting good instruction in decoding and encoding skills would be for young students to have, first of all, the knowledgeable teacher who can explain these patterns that English follow and explicitly teach them sequentially and over a period of time to mastery, so that students are building automaticity, what we call automaticity, meaning they can instantly read those words. And oftentimes what helps that process along is to use text, because it's really important that children are reading text, but text that's controlled with these patterns. It's called, you refer to as decodable text, that has repeating patterns, so that the children do get to that level of fluency and automatic word recognition that's so important. Of course, they have to be accurate as well, so teachers monitoring their accuracy and the fluency. And then, like I said before, complementing with spelling and coding instruction that goes right along with it, because that does reinforce those skills. And making sure that they're progress monitoring along the way. So if the child is not making that progress and not mastering, they have to go back and reteach and spend more time. Some children just need more time with it. And making sure that they're receiving this instruction in small groups, because you can do an overview of some of this in a whole class, but by and large, children need to be put into these small groups that are differentiated by what they're working on at the time, so that they get the instruction that they need at their level.
Mm-hmm. And so parents might hear terms like phonics being used, and so can you talk about how much time, I don't know if you can say but how much time should be spent on teaching the phonics versus reading for fun, and especially I'm thinking of parents working with their kids at home. Should parents be working on phonics or decoding, or should they leave that to the teachers and focus on just building that love of reading for their kids?
The latter. They really should be focusing on spending time enjoying reading together as a family, reading to them, with them, making sure that they're going to the library and selecting books that they find have an interest in. Because if they're reading something that's boring, they're going to be less likely to stick with it. So having a motivation, a desire to read is really important. And unless the parent is an expert in his or her own right, and they could explain things to the child, then that's different. But most parents, you wouldn't expect them to know all the complexities of English. So I think that really needs to be left up to the teacher. And certainly, having said that, the parent who accesses resources like yours to learn about it and to be able to ask questions that point to the fact that they have some knowledge, that goes a long way, because it will help hold a teacher and more importantly, an administrator accountable for making sure that the teachers are getting the support that they need. So learning as much as they can about the process and what goes into it is, I think, really, really important.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned earlier, that sometimes kids just need more of that practice. Mm-hmm. And by reading books at home, some of that practice is happening as you're reading out loud to your kid, and they're following along and sort of building that love of reading, and that's going to make them want to read more and keep increasing that motivation. But yes, we know that kids who struggle with reading oftentimes don't want anything to do with reading, right?
It's true. It's true. But I do want to go back to a question that you asked, because it's a really important one, and that is, what role does phonics play in the big picture? So a long time ago, 2000, now almost 20 years ago, the National Reading Panel did a review of a lot of research around reading, and they said there were 5 big ideas associated with reading: phonics, phonemic awareness, which we talked a little bit about, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary. I didn't say them in the right order. PA, phonics, fluency, vocabulary comprehension. Okay, they're all really, really important. And a skilled teacher is expected to incorporate all 5 of those things into literacy instruction. And so there's a literacy block that during which time of the day when the focus is on teaching kids reading and building their reading skills. Okay, but there's all the other hours in the day. That's usually between an hour and a half and 2 hours a day. It's a dedicated time that should be sacred to making sure kids are, being taught explicitly to read. But comprehension comes in all day long, right? Vocabulary all day long, right? So phonics should be certainly a big part, especially for K and 1 and 2, a big part of the literacy block. But there's also these other things that need to get incorporated into that direct instruction in reading and writing. So I think phonics is certainly a very, like I said, very important part, but there's more to reading than just phonics. Mm-hmm. Phonics should be taught explicitly in kindergarten, first grade, and to some extent in second grade, advanced phonics skills, where children are learning how words are made up of roots, right? Like unfriendly has the root friend, but it also has a prefix un that has meaning. It has suffix ly that has meaning. And so by second grade, children should be learning about that because that's a big part of our language as well. And learning that explicitly will increase not only their ability to read words fluently, but it will build their vocabulary knowledge as well.
Margie, thanks so much for breaking that down. That's super helpful. I'm thinking about teachers. I know that we have some teachers that listen to these and watch these as well. And we know that some teachers haven't received this instruction about how to teach phonics. Or maybe they just received a little bit of training on it, but they're still not really sure. Do you have any recommendations for how they can, are there any resources out there that can teach them how to teach phonics in an evidence-based way? Or what recommendations or advice do you have for teachers?
That's such an important question. I'm so glad you asked it because I don't believe that it's something that you can teach yourself. I do believe, I've spent my whole life learning, and I learn more and more all the time. So I do believe that you need to get some training, and it needs to be fairly substantive to really learn it. And then, of course, practicing it along the way is really important. Ideally, you get somebody who's giving you feedback and watching you teach and seeing how you're incorporating the different levels of phonics instruction into your reading. For me, probably the best way to do that is to teach a good program, to teach an evidence-based phonics program. And then you learn it as you teach it. And it's a program that has all the ingredients that you need. I refer to that as a structured literacy program. And I think parents can look into that and, find a program that is based on the evidence. And it has all the elements that I just mentioned. Wilson is a good example of a structured literacy program. And it does a great job teaching decoding and encoding that we just talked about before. It's not as robust as far as, the comprehension vocabulary instruction because, again, the classic profile of the child that needs the decoding and encoding, usually their language comprehension skills are good. So they don't need as much in the area of vocabulary and comprehension. Having said that, all kids benefit from that instruction as well. So I just think that you want to be looking to a teacher who can teach using a structured literacy program would learn a lot that way. And then just ongoing professional development because things change. Research is coming out every day. I can't keep on top of it because so much is happening in the reading world that would continue to necessitate teachers learning more and more. So ongoing professional development is important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if you are listening to this and you're wondering what other types of programs are out there, or what is structured literacy, and you want to read more about this, we do have articles on Understood that you can use the little search feature and search for dyslexia programs or structured literacy, and it'll pop up with some more information that you can look through. Margie, I know that we spend a lot of time thinking about early elementary when we're talking about reading issues, but we also have a lot of parents that reach out to us and they have kids that are in middle school or even high school that are struggling with reading and sometimes struggling with that decoding part. So can you talk a little bit about, is it still useful, or is there like a cutoff for learning how to decode words and getting this phonics instruction? Or how do parents and kids go about getting this kind of support that they need in the later grades?
It's it's important. It's harder. I'm not going to, sugarcoat this. It is harder to get the right instruction in the middle and high school grades, because at that point the teachers are focused on the content. And they see themselves as content teachers, not as reading teachers. So a parent is going to have to be even more well-informed and willing to talk to administrators specifically about, getting answers to their questions about what is driving the problem. So it's harder to get to the root cause, because by middle school, there are other things that are usually intervening and interfering with getting the bottom line diagnosis. Attention is usually, comes into play. Engagement, motivation, obviously those as well. So you really do want to get a good evaluation and make sure that you have an evaluation that includes an analysis, not just a set of standard scores, but rather what were the behaviors that were noticed while the student was being assessed, to get at the bottom line, what is causing the problems. And then, of course, once you have that clear understanding of what is going on, then you need, even more importantly, you need the expert, evidence-based program. And you have to make tough choices sometimes, because there's limited time. You have to prioritize what is the most important problem. If it is a problem with word recognition, the child is not decoding, never learned it, then that has to be taught. You can't bypass that. And at the same time, because the student is being expected to master content, science, social studies, math, and so forth, they also have to be given that instruction. And so assistive technology is going to be an important part of the equation, making sure that the student has access to, the technology that is going to enable them to keep up with their schoolwork.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love your points there about seeking out a good evaluation to figure out what's driving this reading challenge that your kid has.
Yes.
And if you're looking for more resources on that, again, you can look on Understood's website. We have articles that walk you through the steps of how to request an evaluation and what to look for in those evaluation results. And then from that evaluation, you can work with the school to figure out what accommodations your kid needs, like assistive technology, as Margie was mentioning, that can be super helpful in helping your kid make progress in all of those other areas while they're still working on this reading issue. Margie, we've talked a lot about decoding and phonics, and I want to turn towards reading comprehension. Do you have suggestions for teachers and parents of what they can do to help their kids with reading comprehension?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, comprehension. So if a child's having trouble with reading comprehension, you have to just figure out, again, this is especially true for an older child, you have to figure out if it's a problem because they can't read the words, or if they're just not able to make sense of what they're reading while they're reading. So one of the things that you can do is, if the child is having difficulty reading the text and comprehending at the same time, because you're having to juggle figuring out what these words say, and I'm also doing the heavier lifting of making sense of the text. And if it's complex text that requires inferencing, which most text does, then I'm really having to think while I'm reading. That's reading comprehension, writing. It's about thinking about what I'm reading about. So one thing you could do is take reading the words out of the equation initially and just do the read aloud and make sure that the child is processing the language and understanding the text. And then you have to eventually, just like you're explicitly teaching the word skills, for some students, you have to explicitly teach them about what it is that they have to do while they read. For example, I have to monitor my comprehension when I'm reading. If I'm reading a text and all of a sudden it's not making any sense, I have to know that it didn't make sense. And you have to explain that to a child. For some, you have to say, oh, did you have trouble because you didn't know what that word meant? Or did you have trouble because the author was telling you about something that like you had to have some background knowledge about what the author is telling you about, but you don't have that background knowledge. So teaching them about the strategies that good readers use in order to comprehend text, that's an important part of reading comprehension. And these often are referred to as executive skills. So some of our students with learning disabilities have trouble with executive functioning. I'm sure some parents have heard about executive functioning. You at Understood have done a lot of good work helping parents understand. A lot of what reading comprehension necessitates is organizing thoughts, planning, stopping, rereading, all these things that a good skilled reader does, but some of our children struggle with. So again, figuring out, is that a problem for a child, and how to break it down explicitly. What are these steps that they have to take to get to, really good comprehension of what they read?
Mm-hmm. I think that's so important that you pointed out some kids have to be taught these things explicitly, which means like breaking it down for them and explaining the different strategies that people use as they're reading. And sometimes we don't think of that if we ourselves are like
Right.
really quick at reading and find it to be easy. We might not think of those strategies of like, oh, when I don't understand something, I go back and I reread it and I ask myself, where am I struggling? Is it with this word? Is it with I don't know enough about this topic? If I'm reading something that's about a different country, maybe I don't understand that country well enough to understand what I'm reading. And so I think that's also, it ties into how important it is when teachers are choosing the text that they're using in their classroom, right? And making sure that the kids have the right background knowledge to be able to read that text. And different kids will come in with different background knowledge, and having like that diverse opportunities for kids to read different texts that might relate more to their personal experience, right?
Yep, exactly.
And I realized that I skipped over the reading fluency part. That we talked about decoding and we've talked about reading comprehension. But we know there's some kids that are there in the middle ground, that they've learned how to decode, and so they can sound out that word on the page. But they're just still not reading fluently, which means that they're not able to read quickly or at a appropriate pace for them to understand what they're reading. Are there strategies that parents and teachers can use for helping kids to read more fluently, or is it really just like more practice?
It is more practice, but it also is, again, I'm a broken record saying you got to get to the bottom of the problem, because you're right. If the first step is being accurate, so making sure that the child can accurately sound out the word, knows how to do that. Step one. Step two is they have to do it automatically. So some kids are accurate, but it takes them a while to blend those sounds. So you need to work on, again, those patterns that seem to be problematic so that they are automatic. The third step is they have to be able to look at text and group words into meaningful phrases. And in order to do that, to make it fluent, because if they're reading robotically word by word, then they're probably not making meaning, like we talked about a few minutes ago, that you have to do when you comprehend to comprehend text. So practicing, we do this scooping thing for kids, where they're scooping the phrases. The big brown fox jumped over the tall fence, or whatever, chunking the text into these meaningful phrases that facilitate good reading fluency. That's also an important skill that goes into reading fluency. Some kids are slow at processing. So one of the things that we measure when we look diagnostically at what's driving problems, one of the things we're going to be assessing is naming speed. Naming speed is how quickly you can name something, whether it's a color, a letter, a number, an object, okay? And you do this in 45 seconds, so it's super easy to test. And basically, it's your processing speed. It's how quickly you can retrieve the name of something, also called naming speed. If a child is born, and this is something you're pretty much born with, slow processing speed, it's not correlated at all with intelligence, not one bit. But if you have that, if you're born with that slower processing speed, it's going to take you a while to read something, right? So your fluency is going to be slower. And that's frustrating for some children, as you would expect, because as time goes on and they get in the upper grades, they're expected to read a lot. And if they read slowly, and they don't like to read to begin with, that's an issue for them. But that is part of the equation when we're looking at reading fluency. So saying to a child, read faster, read faster, read faster, let's read this, let's try to get to this 90% goal of fluency is not a realistic expectation for that child with slower, naming speed. Mm-hmm. Just something to think about.
Yeah, and we do have articles on Understood as well about slow processing speed. So if that's a concern of yours, you can search for that. And I love, Margie, how you broke down how we chunk things when we read, and that can be explicitly taught to kids of how to chunk the different phrase or the different words in a sentence in order to read it more fluently and have better reading comprehension of what you're reading. I do want to get to some of the parent questions that came in. This question is from Mama Bear 3. And she asks, she has a child going into second grade who is struggling on standardized testing in ELA, English Language Arts. How soon into the new school year should I request an RTI? And for our viewers, RTI is response to intervention. And I'm sure Margie can talk more about that. This parent says, I know he will need formalized interventions. And so the question is, how soon should I request those interventions or some sort of support or an evaluation from the school? It's important because the standardized test that she's probably referring to is old data, right? So if it's most likely by the time the parent gets the results, it's not current. So you do want to give the school time to administer a baseline in the new grade, but it should happen within the first few weeks of school. So as soon as they can get the information, in Connecticut, we have to screen kids, administer universal screening to kids in K through third grade. 3 times a year. So they do it in September, they do it again in January, December, January, and then again at the end of the year. So that should happen. I don't know what state this person is in. But regardless of whether or not there's a policy in schools do administer assessments at the beginning of the year to get a baseline. So the parent should ask when those assessments, are being administered, and then ask for the results to see
where that student is, and if they're below baseline, below benchmark rather, then they should be, the parent should have a meeting with the teacher in the school to see what they're going to do. Most schools do have RTI, response to intervention. Tier 2 it's called. So Tier 2 is when I'm not meeting the benchmark goals for the classroom, and I need an extra dose of instruction. And that extra dose is done again in a small group, often, not always, but sometimes by a reading interventionist, a reading specialist who's really well informed, hopefully, to know what to do for that child to get them up to that grade level score.
Okay, Margie, thank you so much for that. We have another question from a parent. It says, my son is in 4th grade and was diagnosed with dyslexia last year. His public school has provided LLI for him. I'm not sure what that is, but maybe you do, Margie. And he has made little to no progress. We are advocating for evidence-based approaches such as multisensory, structured, and phonics, but the staff don't have the training in these methods. And this parent's asking, how do we most effectively work with the school to bring in the resources they need to implement an appropriate evidence-based program? It's a big question.
It is a big question. These are all great questions because LLI is used often as the intervention. It's used throughout Connecticut as well. And I think it probably works okay for kids without dyslexia, maybe some. But for kids with dyslexia, it's not explicit enough in the PA, phonemic awareness and phonics aspects of reading that we've talked about today. So what do? I think you have to, again, as a parent, you have to be an advocate. You have to bring evidence to the school. What is structured literacy? What is a structured literacy program? What distinguishes it from, a program like level literacy intervention, which is what Louise Spear-Swirling refers to as a typical program for kids that are not dyslexic, that do not have reading disabilities. I think you just have to be that squeaky wheel. And you have such great information on your website to point parents in the right direction. The International Dyslexia Association is also has a great website with great fact sheets, and print out the fact sheets, bring them to the school. And, in some cases, parents have to educate. It seems crazy, but it's true. The parent has to educate the administrators and the teachers about these programs that are based on research. And there's controversy around this, right? I mean, PBS did a segment not too long ago on dyslexia, and quite a few researchers in the field of reading said that they didn't agree with even what dyslexia was or that it existed. Mm-hmm. So it's a problem because there are lots of educators that don't believe in the evidence base that I certainly subscribe to, and many researchers subscribe to. So we still, unfortunately, have this divide. And it really, I think what's changed the landscape a great deal are parents like the one who asked the question, who want to help not just their own children, but the children that will come after their children. And we owe it to them to be our children's advocates.
Well said. Thank you, Margie. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'm wondering, do you have any last words of advice or encouragement for these parents and these teachers out there working with these kids who struggle with reading?
My advice is to keep seeking the truth and finding the evidence and research behind the programs and approaches that are being used. And for teachers, I work with teachers every day, so I do not ever want to blame teachers 99% of the time. They're doing the very best they can. So I want to encourage them to also advocate for themselves, because they are the victims in some cases. I don't hate to use the victim word, but they are the recipient of whatever the district administrators, boards of ed choose for them to use to teach reading. And they don't have much say in that. So I think teachers have to become very, knowledgeable and advocate. And if they feel like they're not given the tools they need, they have to ask for those tools. They have to become, vocal and find your allies, teachers. Find other teachers who you can work with, because it's hard to be a lone ranger. Find other people that you can work with, and then get involved. Get on committees that look at programs, so that you can influence decisions that are being made.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Margie. This has been really informative, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
You bet. Thank you. Thanks
Right.
for asking me.
Of course. And thanks to all of our viewers for watching today. If you have more questions, or if your question didn't get answered today, you might want to consider joining our community. And there's lots of families that are in there asking questions, responding to each other, supporting each other. And a lot of times the best advice can come from another family who's in a similar situation. You can find that at u.org/community. And if you want to see what other upcoming chats we have, you can find that at u.org/calendar. Thanks so much and have a great day.